Hello and hello and welcome to this Churchyard Ramble. These rambles are really all about trying to get over the frustration of not being able to meet up in person, not being able to actually explore the history of the churchyard and the history of Sutton. We are nevertheless living through historic times, and I think it's an ideal opportunity to be able to take some time for history and explore together really that deep history of Sutton. And I am so pleased that we are able to have the support of Enjoy Sutton and Sutton Civic Society for these little rambles. And by the way, I'm Jeff Richards. I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard. Now, Enjoy Sutton is an organisation that brings together more than 500 local businesses and organisations, largely based on the High Street, and looking at projects and services that support our town. It's all about community and it's all about business. And the Sutton Civic Society is a civic organisation that looks at the promotion of civic pride and the idea that we should be able to be inspired for progressive improvement in the quality of life within the town in which we live. So it's all about how we make Sutton a better place. If you want to get involved in an organisation that is a critical friend of the council in planning concerns, then the Sutton Civic Society is the group to join. And I am so pleased that we are also liaising with Sutton College, because I'm going to be touching on a number of different topics here about the Reformation, about changes in religious belief, comparative religion belief, how phenomenology of religion has changed. And I think it's worth understanding that you can go to Sutton College and there's loads of courses there on history and culture which will help you explore the topics that I'll raise during today's little ramble. Well, where I'm going to go next is actually the topic of today is really all about the cult of saints, and I wanted to take this opportunity to explore medieval spirituality. Now, spirituality is not a constant. Our concept of that is not a constant. So, medieval spirituality is an extraordinarily long period of time. But I want to explore and see what we can learn about the experience that individuals that we know who lived in Sutton, how they experienced the sacred and how that sense of the divine shaped the way in which they lived. Now, we have the best source of information comes from wills, and we have wills from people, named individuals like Alice Stuart, who died in 1483, and I mentioned last week, and there's William Morland, who was the priest of St Nicholas actually at the time that she lived. There's a whole flurry of little groups of wills around the end of the 15th century and earlier on into the 15th century that tell us about the concerns of individuals, men and women, who lived in Sutton. It tells us about their hopes, and it also tells us how they understood their faith was to be lived out. And this is what I want to explore right now. And perhaps one of the oldest expressions of faith we know of within Sutton is also one that is full of anxiety and gets to the core of the mindset of the medieval mind, the heart of what somebody in Sutton 500, 600, 700 years ago would have considered. On the old building, on the north side of the nave, under a window, were carved a series of letters. And they were recorded in John Aubrey's book, The Natural History and Antiquities of the County of Surrey, that he had started to write in the 1670s. And they were also included in Lison's Environs of London in 1792. So we know that they're there and that they're referring back to something that is much earlier. Now, the scratch letters were irregular and they were hard to read because of their age in 1670. And their text seems to be partly in Latin and partly in what looked like French. And the letters that could be made out were the sign of a cross, PRI, full stop, per, will, foul, Alicia, Matt, Eliot S. Now, Lison translated this as pray for William Fowl and Alice, his mother. Brayley in Britain state that the window referred to had been removed some years ago and the larger one fixed in its place. So we don't have the inscription anymore. It was in the old building and it didn't even last the changes in the end of the 18th century. So there was some time between when Lison recorded the inscription and sometime before 1800 when the porch was added to the north side of the church. The window was lost. But someone in the village of Sutton had enough learning to grope for the right words and carve them into stone of the church. And it's most likely to be one of the priests of Sutton or one of their servants or kinfolk. And there's evidence that the clergy of Sutton were increasingly in the service of the king from the 14th century and employed in legal matters. So there's no problem in them knowing the Latin or knowing even the court Latin, but the strange mix indicates that this is somebody who is only on the fringes of that learning. But the instruction within that phrase, pray for William Fowl and Alice, his mother, is the instruction to prayer, the centrality for that. And they're praying, it's a request to pray for the welfare of their souls. And for all Christians, but especially really within the medieval period when the soul represented the most precious aspect of the person. That is the essence of the person, the immortal, the perpetual, the eternal, and the thing that had the hope of either elevation and unity within the kingdom of God in heaven or condemnation into hell. And Christians believed in everyone's responsibility to pray, but there were specialists within medieval society. It was a threefold division of society where the Lord and the militaries had the responsibility to defend and to fight physically in the temporal world and to rule. And you had then the church, which had the responsibility to pray for all of those. So if you had the military, the lords, the king, who had the responsibility to defend, you had the church with the responsibility to pray, and then you had the laity, the common folk, who had the responsibility to feed and to clothe and to work the land and to trade, to make society run. But you have this need for everyone to pray because of this desire for the soul to make a transition to heaven. And it's way down in the reality that in this life no one could escape sin. You cannot leave a purely good life. If we think about the dilemma today, you think that you are leading a good life, but actually everything that we do has unintended consequences that if we had the deepest wisdom in the world, we may have been able to overcome. Somebody who is opting to perhaps be a good and ethical person may in fact be unaware that the clothes that they're wearing has involved modern day slavery, or that the trade routes that they are in essentially are to driving modern imperialism with based on forms of unjust loans to countries. It's very difficult to escape the web of sin, and for a medieval mind, they knew that full well, and that their lives were full of compromise. You had the requirement that all Christians had to attend Mass. They had to attend the religious service. They had to give their confession. They had to be constantly shrived. But most of the people in Sutton were shepherds. And that's why you had the tradition when they were buried that a wisp of wool would be placed into their coffin so that on Judgment Day the requirements of being a shepherd would sometimes outweigh the awfulness of needing to constantly be in prayer and preparation of your soul for the afterlife. Somebody like Alice Stuart, for example, who we know from last week's Ramble, was a shepherd. She had over 70 sheep. She didn't get to church. She missed services. The care of the sheep were needed. And so she would have been buried with a wisp of wool, just so that the angels would be reminded that she had other duties as well. And so there was this sense that not all Christians, when they died, would automatically join the saints in heaven. There was this other level of purity that needed to be obtained, this purification process. Now, within the medieval church, you had this division between the concept of the church triumphant, the church, the men and women of all types, of all classes, who were in heaven, rejoicing, fully united with Jesus and in the arms of God. You had the church militant, which was the experience of the church as it fought against the sins and temptations of this world, as it prepared to join the church triumphant. But between them stood the church expectant, the church that had passed between the militant, temporal world that we live in now to that period of waiting for the resurrection and the rejoining with the Heavenly Father. And that expectant church is where we would experience the concept of purgatory, where there would be a requirement for souls to be cleansed after death. And this is probably the most important aspect of the medieval spirituality, when wanting to prepare yourself for death and then looking to reduce that time in purgatory so that you can rejoin the church triumphant and be part of the heavenly host. In modern phrase, that sense of purgatory is defined as all who die in God's grace and friendship but are still imperfectly purified. And so this is a period of time that is after death. And it's where, in the context of the communion of saints, where there is no strict division between the living here and the kingdom of God that is at hand and surrounds us, where we are constantly surrounded by the communion of saints and a host of witnesses. There was no sense that there was a strict division. You just as you would look to your Lord, who is the guardian of the loaf, the bread, the hlafword is the Saxon for the guardian of the bread, just as that Lord guarded that, you had the church who was in the cure of your soul, the well-being of your soul. And so the whole church, whole brothers and sisters, your siblings, your godparents, your god brothers and your god sisters, your siblings in baptism would also be called to pray for you at your death. So your time for purification would be reduced. That sense of patronage where just as you would invoke your Lord for a favour, you could invoke a saint for a favour to help you push over the edge. And that sense of living in a communion that was continuous between the living and the dead was most tangible right from the earliest points within the church. Praying for the dead was embedded into the early church, and that is right back into the 4th century and earlier. And there's evidence even within Paul's letters that there should be a sense of prayer for the departed so that God would judge them kindly. Now, we took a rational. We are children of the Reformation. We are children of with the change in beliefs around that sense of purgatory and cleansing. The Church of England, the mother church of the Anglican Communion, officially denounced the Romish doctrine concerning purgatory within the 39 Articles of Religion. But that need to mitigate your time that was in purgatory really was fundamental into the beliefs of anyone within Sutton. And it was reflected then within what people chose to mention within their wills. Let's have a look now at Alice Stuart's will once more, and we can start to get a sense of what she was concerned on and how her will really does start to show us how everything was focused on the well-being of somebody's soul, even though overtly the terms of the will might actually be seemingly to do with very practical matters. Here we can see Alice's will, and Alice's will is one of a group of about 11 wills that have been recorded in different publications that mention Sutton in between about 1450 to 1568. So they stretch from that period that is in the High Middle Ages, the if you like, the peak of what we would understand of as religion that was very firmly medieval Catholic through to the Reformation period, the journey of spirituality through the Reformation period until finally we have a will in 1568. But let's just look at what Alice is doing in this will as she remembers each of the people in her will. It's a very wise and clever thing, and it's summed up. And the way to read this is to look at what actually leaps out within the phrase. Right at the end of her will, she nominates Richard Cook and Nicholas Broke as executors for the welfare of my soul. And let's see what she does this. Now, the will has been probably recorded by William Morland. That's somebody that we have actually the will for. And we also have Richard Cook's will as well. So we have a real good snapshot of belief. But this is been recorded by either William Morland or one of the other priests associated with Sutton at that time. It says, to the said church, a coverlet, that's going to be an altar cloth. To the reparation and upkeep of the said church, 20 sheep. To the high altar of the said church, for my tithes forgot, 20 pence. See, she's leaving money in an ongoing way. She is the central act of Christian worship is the Mass, so she's leaving an altar cloth. She's leaving sheep so that the worship and upkeep of the church can keep going. She's indicating that this is a wealthy woman with respectable position with society, comparatively wealthy considering she's a peasant. She is forgiving. She's asking forgiveness for tithes just in case she had forgotten anything or misaccounted for anything or diddled the church out of anything. She leaves money, or she doesn't leave money, she leaves 1/4 of malt for the maintenance of the light of St. Catherine. So it tells us that we had a light of St. Catherine, an image in front of a picture of St. Catherine, a torch or a candle in front of the image of St. Catherine, and she leaves 1/4 of malt. So there's probably a guild, a group of people who are sworn together to maintain that light, and the leaving of the malt indicates that she may well have been intending this for a church ale, the idea that you sell beer for the maintenance of the church. She also leaves to the Mother Church of Winchester 6 pence, and that indicates that she's probably been on pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Swithin, who was the patron saint of Winchester. And so that idea that she's leaving it to the church, and that would have placed, it's only 6 pence, but it would have placed an element of obligation on the canons of Winchester to remember her amongst the benefactors of the cathedral, the Mother Church. She asks for an honest priest of good fame shall celebrate in the said church, that's St. Nicholas, for an entire year for my soul and for the souls of my friends. So she's being very, very good. She wants her own soul to be lifted out of purgatory, but because of the web of relationships that exists, she doesn't want to do this on her own. She's doing it for the benefit of her friends and neighbours. She leaves 4 torches, 4 candles to the church, and to each of my godsons 1 sheep. By leaving a sheep something in the will, that obliges her godsons to, in the reciprocal relationships, to pray for her soul. And look at how many people she spreads that love around, that responsibility to Alice. These are all the named people in her will. Alice Hitchcock, her niece. Walter, her servant, Richard Stuart, Nicholas Brooke and Emota, John Hall, William Mayer, each of the sons of Thomas Wood, each of the sons of Richard Cook, William Plaistow, Henry Taylor, Joan Bulk, John Pound, Giles Croucher, John Stewart, each of the sons of John Gilden, 1 sheep, Richard Stewart. Each of these are going to pray for her, including Matilda Dunning, Thomas Hitchcock, Robert Hounswell, Roger Morris, and John Smaley's wife. They're all obliged to pay for her. And another thing that she does here is because there's no, you might think it's really strange, but medieval wills very often have phrases to the maintenance of the highway. There were guilds and parish and organisations within the parish that would repair roads, and up until the Reformation, this was clearly seen as to the benefit of your soul if you repaired bridges and roads, because it allowed people's lives to be better, and it was a way of sharing that love to your neighbour, and to the repair of the highway in Sutton she leaves 6 shillings and 8 pence. Clearly, it's more important that in terms of the road than the 6 pence that went to the cathedral. Her immediate needs of her neighbours are being met there, all to that. And it keeps going in terms of obliging people to acknowledge benefit from the will. So you have Richard Cook and his fellows, my fee shall give Nicholas and Emota his wife Elise in a croft of land called North Rushmead in Sutton, to hold said croft of land with its appurtenances to said Nicholas and Emota his wife for her survivorship, to find yearly 3 wax candles, each 2 pounds in weight, to stand before the images of Saint Mary the Virgin, the Crucifix, and Saint Nicholas in the Church of Sutton. So this is telling us we've got, they're praying to Catherine, we're praying to Swithin because of the diff to Winchester. We've got Saint Mary being called out, and Saint Nicholas, of course, being called out as well. All for the welfare of my soul. And that preoccupation on the soul is echoed in many of the other wills that we have recorded right from the earliest time. Alice Stuart had died in 1483 or 1484. Somebody else who died that we know of in 1484 was a guy called Richard Hayton or Peyton. He lived in Sutton, and he charged his son to pray for his soul. Another resident of Sutton was a man called John North, and he died just a few years later in 1487. And in his will, he asked that he should be buried in St. Nicholas's Churchyard, and he left the church a heifer and 2 sheep that would go towards the maintenance of the light of St. Mary. And he charged his father to pray for his soul. Richard Cook, who we met as the executor of Alice Stuart, he died in 1494, so that's 10 years after Alice died. And he also asked to be buried, he actually asked to be buried in the parish church of St. Nicholas of Sutton, so he's somebody who had that wealth and power to be asked to be buried in the church, not just the churchyard. And he left money to be, he wanted to be buried right in front of the chapel of St. Mary the Virgin instead of the altar. So he also left money to Winchester and also to the repairs of the high altar at Sutton Church. Especially important, he asked for masses to be celebrated for the quarter year, for my soul, for the soul of my father, William Cook, for my mother, Joan, and wife, Joan, and the souls of all my relations and benefactors. And this was to take place at Easter and then continue next year, for 4 years at the discretion of the executors concerning payment. So basically until the money ran out. But things started to change during the 16th century. So we had ideas which were essentially Protestant in nature starting to circulate. So Martin Luther had nailed his theses on the door of Wittenberg in 1517. William Tyndale had published his English translation of the Bible in 1524. And the momentum within England was such that you had King Henry VIII proclaiming, or as part of his royal style, as of the Church of England in earth, under Jesus Christ supreme head, to his royal style. So he added that to his royal style, which basically means that he was the head of the Church of England, not the Pope. So these are dramatic changes starting to take place in the 16th century, and Sutton's people experienced a very dramatic and it would have been alienating change in 1538 when Chertsey Abbey was dissolved, and we got a new Lord of the Manor. Other changes happened very, very rapidly. We had a great Bible, something called the Great Bible, which was basically Coverdale's translation of the Bible, which was published in 1539, and churches started to use that within services. And that was the first English translation authorised for use in parish churches. But still, even in 1539, traditional belief was very much present. So a woman called Alice Lord, who had property in Sutton but lived in Westminster, she asked for something called a trental of masses to be said. So a trental is a set of 30 requiem masses. It's very much like what Richard Cook had asked for, in so many masses to be said for himself, for his soul, and the souls of those who are his friends and benefactors. We had so much change taking place, but still there was this clinging to the way in which the medieval spirituality continued even into the middle of the Reformation. So you had Richard Eliot, who was actually the vicar of Sutton, or now rector of Sutton, died in 1543, and he was buried in the Church of Sutton at the high altar before the picture of Our Lady. So we know the picture of Our Lady is up at the St. Nicholas altar end of the church. And he asked for a priest to sing for me for 1 year. And that was in 1543. But by 1549, when the Book of Common Prayer became the only lawful form of public worship, everything had changed. And by the time that a man called Anthony Gravel of Sutton died in 1568, the altars of Mary, the altars of Catherine and St. Nicholas were long gone. And in 1568, he described his will like this. In November 1568, in the 35th year of Elizabeth, our most sovereign lady, Anthony Gravel of the parish of Sutton, County Surrey, Diocese of Winchester, to be buried in the churchyard of Itchingfield, County Sussex, in which parish I lie sick. To the poor of the parish of Sutton, there's a sum of money here, but it's illegible. To the poor of Itchingfield, a sum of money, which is illegible, and to Sutton likewise. So Anthony's will said nothing about his soul and spoke only of his property. Where previously charity had been given to benefit the donor's soul, it was now given with no reference to it being a holy act. And instead of honouring the Virgin Mary, it honoured the Virgin Queen. That's how dramatic the change had been. Well, thank you very much for listening to this. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel where you'll find all of the different rambles contained there, listed there. I've touched on a number of different things as we've gone through here. I've gone through ideas about religion, spirituality. I've talked about the Reformation, something that I'll probably talk about again later on in a ramble specifically, and look at the changes made there. If you're interested in any of these sort of ideas, which have both a national, international, and also cultural, historical perspective, then please do check out the courses at Sutton College. Excellent resources there. Next week, we are going to be continuing our story, so please do join me then as we talk about another subject inside St. Nick's history. But for now, I'll say goodbye. So long, Sutton, your history.